So in this video lecture, we will discuss from a biological perspective, sex and gender in humans. And again, this is from really a biological perspective, and there are a lot of gaps in our knowledge of the relationship between biology and brain function and sexuality and gender. So I want to start off by using the definitions for sex and gender that are commonly used in biomedical fields, so biological research, neuroscience research. So sex is typically defined as being the biologically determined birth assigned sex. So it's based on your genotype, two X chromosomes, female, an XY chromosome, male, as reflected in the reproductive organs. So if you have a testes and associated external genitalia like a penis, then you're male. If you have ovaries and associated female external genitalia, a vagina, labia, and a clitoris, you're female. So this is traditionally how the term sex is used in this field of research. In the field of gender and women's studies and other psychology and sociology fields, obviously the definition is a little bit different. So I just wanted to kind of present you with the way that your textbook uses this term. Now, gender, of course, is based on self-identification, and it is subjective. Of course, you can identify with any gender. It doesn't have to match your biological sex. And what triggers a difference between how you identify and your biological sex is unclear. It is unknown. It is clearly some combination, probably, of genes and the environment, but it's not entirely clear. And more recently, and your textbook doesn't address this, but there's been a lot more awareness of transgender individuals. And identifying as transgender is basically the perception that your biological sex, your body, doesn't match the way that you identify your gender. So there is some evidence from newer research that this is a combination of genes and the environment, that androgen effects in the brain are different depending on certain genes. So it may be that there are some organizational effects of androgens in the brain in transgender individuals, but this kind of research is really in its infancy, so we don't fully understand it. But one of the leading hypotheses in the field is that it may be that, kind of in the first 2 months of life, the genitals and the reproductive system is differentiating, but the brain is differentiating in later prenatal months under different hormonal conditions. And so it could be that you get this mismatch between what the body's sex appears to be and how an individual identifies their gender. Again, this is a very cursory view and definition of these terms. But we are limited in this course to kind of talking about it from this biological perspective right now because there's just not a lot known. So studies of human sexual behavior have shown that obviously human sexual behavior is super different from other mammals that have stereotypical behaviors that typically copulate under the direction of hormones, right? Hormones drive that behavior. Hormones really in humans only play what's called a permissive role. They can, increase your sex drive, but, there is a very wide range of hormone levels that is, found in humans. And there is really no correlation between the levels of gonadal hormones and sex drive. That there are many other factors and other brain circuits that are involved. And there's, what drives us to engage in sexual behavior is based on emotion, motivations, desires that we have that may have nothing to do with hormones. Also, compared to other species, there are many more coitus postures available to us, and we can verbally report orgasm. And orgasm is not just a means to reproduction in humans, it is a source of pleasure. So it's very different than in non-human mammals. Now, the earliest studies of human sexual behavior were done by Albert Kinsey in the 40s, and he basically gave surveys to many, many different people. I will say predominantly, a white population, middle class population. But what these surveys revealed was a surprising amount of diversity in sexual behavior in what appeared outwardly to be a very homogeneous, kind of straightforward population. And from that, in the 60s, William Masters and Virginia Johnson actually did physiological experiments and observations of individuals who are engaged in sex. And their research is described in a nonfiction book called Masters of Sex that's really easy to read and has been the basis for the Showtime series Masters of Sex, which is really interesting if you want to kind of have an entertainment view of how this kind of research is done. And basically their research showed that, that there are certain physiological stages of human sexual behavior that are common, arousal, orgasm, and things like that, but that there, again, is a huge variety in what people find to be the motivation for sexual behavior and what people find to be fulfilling types of sexual behavior. So human sexual behavior cannot be modeled in animals. It's not at all the same. And so one of the questions is really, is the human brain then sexually dimorphic? If we have a variety of different sexual behaviors that don't really map onto our biological sex, are there areas of the brain that are dimorphic? And so, neuroanatomists and some folks with a very strong biomedical perspective have tried to do these studies where they image brains and they try to identify areas that are bigger in females or areas that are bigger in males. And that's the results of such studies are sort of shown here. So they control for different brain sizes, and then they just show you that all these pink areas are larger in a healthy female brain, all these blue areas larger in a healthy male brain. However, these are big areas. They don't map onto any particular function or any particular behavior. So it doesn't really tell us anything. If we just are looking at brain size, and it may just be that in this particular group of people we see these differences. Brains really vary from person to person. So in other words, these kind of studies are not informative. They don't tell us anything about function. They don't tell us anything about whether there is a female or a male brain. And based on behaviors that we see, it is probably, and what the evidence would bear out, is that both nature and nurture are having influences on brain function, and that the size of these areas is not the relevant variable. What's relevant is how different areas of the brain function to determine, what people's sexual preferences are, what kind of behaviors they like to engage in, and that it's a much more complicated issue in the human brain where we have cognitive and emotional factors as well as just hormonal factors. So likely what's happening in terms of the development of the human brain is there's a complex combination of both genes, prenatal androgen exposure, and then a lot of social influences that we're not even really aware of that kind of shape the regions of the brain, which we haven't even really identified yet, as being the ones that are important in driving our sexual behavior. So some of the evidence that there may be a biological component and that there may be some organizational effects of androgens on the human brain come from a few disorders that of abnormal sexual differentiation. So I want to cover a couple of these just to kind of give you a little bit of background about why people think there may be some organizational effects on the human brain of gonadal hormones. And the first of these is called cloacal exstrophy. And this involves individuals who have a male genotype, so an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. Because they have the Y chromosome, they have the SRY gene, which makes the SRY protein, which triggers in early embryonic development the development of the testes. Now, because the testes are there, there is some testosterone secretion, obviously, but for some reason, the external genitalia develop abnormally. And so, as a result, what typically will happen is that, you should do with the SRY protein and the testes and secretion of testosterone, you should end up with male external genitalia, a penis, a scrotal sac with the testes. In the case of cloacal exstrophy, the penis doesn't develop at all or develops abnormally and can't be surgically corrected because of all of the complex ductwork. And so these individuals historically, until recent decades, have had sexual reassignment, surgery to remove the testes and to reconstruct the genitalia into female genitalia early on in life, often as very young babies. And then they're raised as girls. And what has been found in studies of these individuals is that later in life, more than 50% of them will go on to identify their gender as male, even though they had no idea that they were born in this way and had an operation to sort of feminize their genitalia. So, in other words, there is a suggestion here that the prenatal androgen exposure, because these individuals had functioning testes that secreted testosterone, that it's possible that there was an effect of androgen on the brain that masculinized the brain, so that in adulthood, even though these individuals have had female genitalia and were raised as girls all their life, they still identify as male in adulthood. So that is one. This disorder is one piece of information that we use to provide a bit of evidence that prenatal androgen exposure masculinizes the brain even in humans. However, I will point out that the other 50% identify their gender as female. So clearly social influences play a role. Being, raised as a female and with, socialized as females clearly is having an effect as well. So it's a little bit hard to pinpoint here because we can't do those kind of experiments that we did in the rats where, you give them injections of different hormones at birth and see if you can switch up how people identify in adulthood. You can't do that in humans, so we can just kind of draw the conclusion from this study that maybe gender identity is a result of a combination of biological nature, prenatal androgen exposure effects, and the interactions of that with the way that we are socialized. So complex nature and nurture interactions. But it's interesting to think about this 50% that identify their gender as male, even when they had no idea that they were that they really were male. Something to think about. Another disorder that has been used as a piece of evidence to suggest that androgens may masculinize the human brain is a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH. And in this condition, females are what are called partially masculinized. So for some reason, you get genetic female embryos that get exposed to high levels of androgens in utero, often from their mother's adrenal glands hypersecreting them. Because there's no SRY gene and no SRY protein, their gonads develop into ovaries, so they develop normally, but the external genitalia is often intersex, something between traditional male and female external genitalia. And this is due to this exposure of androgens. So you get sort of these the labia of the female genitalia are fused. You get a structure that embryologically comes from the same tissue. The penis and the clitoris come from the same tissue embryologically, but you get something in between, a phallus, which is a in between size, and other kinds of intersex external genitalia. And so after birth, these individuals often get surgery to modify the genitalia, and they're given medication to suppress androgen production from their own adrenal glands so that you don't get further masculinization. And what psychologists and sociologists and medical professionals have observed is that the behaviors of these CAH girls, right, they're all females that were exposed to androgens, the behaviors are often intermediate. They tend to be tomboys, called tomboys, more often than girls that do not have this condition. They have enhanced spatial abilities compared to non-CAH girls, although this is a subject of debate as to whether this is these spatial abilities is something that really even differs between males and females. And interestingly, they're more likely than the general population to be homosexual, possibly due to organization of the brain by prenatal exposure to androgens that more masculinizes the brain and perhaps leads to a preference to be attracted to women versus men. So again, all of this is just observational. There's no way to demonstrate that there's cause and effect here, but it does suggest that prenatal androgen exposure in females does have an effect on at least the genitalia, as well as potentially adult sexual preferences and behaviors that you don't see in girls that don't get this prenatal androgen exposure. The question is whether, that is really a biological effect, or is it just the product of the fact that parents have raised this child differently, knowing that they have this ambiguous genitalia and they're not sure how to treat them, and so maybe they're socialized in a more broad way with fewer gender stereotypes and gender norms placed upon them, so they're more free to have these other kinds of behaviors. So, for every argument for the idea that prenatal androgen exposure can masculinize the female brain and masculinizes the male brain in humans, you can also make an argument that it is social influences that cause this. So again, just food for thought. The third disorder I want to talk about is androgen insensitivity syndrome, and this happens in genetic males, and they have mutated androgen receptor gene. So this means that they cannot make functional androgen receptors, so no matter how much testosterone is around, their cells can't respond to it. So because they have the Y chromosome, they have the SRY gene, they make the SRY protein, which triggers the normal development of testes and embryonic development. Testosterone is produced by these testes. There's nothing stopping that. It's perfectly healthy. However, all the testosterone that is produced cannot have any influences on the cells because the cells have this mutated androgen receptor. Testosterone just cannot bind this receptor. And so what happens is, because the development of the external genitalia is dependent on testosterone and other androgens binding these receptors, the external genitalia think, hey, they're in the absence of testosterone, I must develop into female. And so you get these external genitalia that are developed in a female pattern. But these, even though the external genitalia are female, these individuals are not women. Their internal reproductive organs are testes, and they make sperm. They don't have a uterus, they don't have periods, there's no ovaries, they're not fertile. And so what happens is there is this this mismatch between, sort of the genes and the circulating hormones, and then the response in the rest of the body. Behaviorally, most of these individuals, such as these shown here, tend to look and behave as stereotypical female individuals. They're heterosexual at the rate of the general population, and they tend to seek families through adoption. So this again is a piece of evidence that maybe prenatal hormone exposure differentiates the brain. So if the cells in the brain of these individuals can't respond to the testosterone that's around because they don't have the receptors for it, maybe this is why they identify as female in adulthood. But again, it could be social influences of just being raised as girls that give these characteristics. And of course, we all know now that all of these sort of the way that we identify as adults and behave can't be boiled down to we look and behave female, because there's a huge range of female behaviors. So these studies are very difficult to interpret with our current thinking of the way that sexuality and gender works, that it's more fluid, that it is more, clearly not, there's not a binary to it. So all of these older studies that kind of look at these issues don't take that into account. So they're a little hard to interpret, and studies that are coming up in the future should give us a lot more information on the influence on whether androgen exposure has any influence on the development of the human brain. So I think it'll be something interesting to look forward to. Now, I did want to say a few words about sexual orientation, and I want to caveat this by saying it's an incomplete summary. Basically, we don't have a lot of evidence that there are huge biological effects on sexual orientation, other than the fact that sexual orientation is often determined early in life. It cannot be changed by any known method. Many of those attempted methods are very harmful to individuals psychologically. And so there's no evidence that most people choose their sexual orientation. There are, of course, individuals that are fluid, but if, people's sexual orientation tends to be in the majority, not something that is chosen. So this is thought to be and interpreted to be evidence that there must be something biological going on, because social influences don't seem to have an effect on sexual orientation. So the question is, what biological factors could be involved? Well, prenatal androgen exposure could have effects on the brain. That combined with genetic factors could be playing a role. Also, there's a few genes that have been associated with sexual orientation. There's this weird fraternal birth order effect that seems to have some weight behind it, but there's really no explanation for the underlying mechanism. These are just some biological measures that are correlated with the probability of identifying as homosexual. But there's, obviously a wide spectrum of sexual orientation, and we're complex cognitive, psychological, biological beings, and so as a result, the way that all of these factors interact to produce sexual orientation is not well understood, and again, still the subject of a lot of study. So I call this an incomplete summary because it's very incomplete, it's very cursory, but I did want to mention that there are a few biological correlates that are related to the probability of individuals identifying as homosexual.